Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the fourth and final Oakeshott Lecture of 2024 in these marvellous surroundings of the Sheldonian Theatre. My name is Mark Littlewood, and since February of this year, I have been the director of a new political movement called Popular Conservatism. I've always wanted to set up a body that was based on an oxymoron, and I have finally achieved it. My new organisation asks the question, from a conservative perspective, why, after 14 years of conservative government, do we find on any metric you may care to name the United Kingdom in a less conservative place than the Conservatives found it in? Was this merely a failure of political nerve, a lack of political competence, or was something else going on? The man giving tonight's lecture has furnished my new organisation over recent months with many, perhaps even all, of the answers to that question. I had met Dr. David Starkey a couple of times in my previous role as the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. But it's when I moved on to consider politics and policy through a more constitutional or institutional lens, rather than merely from an economic perspective, that I had, over several lunches, it has to be confessed, a number of eureka moments when hearing Dr. Starkey's analyses and prescriptions of what had gone wrong in Britain from a conservative perspective. The title of tonight's lecture is The Strange Death of Conservative England, echoing, of course, the title of the seminal text, although a widely criticised text, it's fair to say, from 1935, Dangerfield's The Strange Death of Liberal England. Is conservatism today experiencing a similar and possibly equally permanent decline in terms of its political relevance and its power in public policy? Our lecturer this evening is an historian whose many works include Monarchy from the Middle Ages to Modernity, Magna Carta, The True Story Behind the Charter, and Henry, Model of a Tyrant. His numerous historical TV series have made him a household name in Britain. He is, I feel confident in saying, Britain's leading conservative public intellectual. To deliver this Oakeshott lecture, please welcome the sometimes controversial, the frequently provocative, but the always thoroughly engaging Dr. David Starkey.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. We are here really, I suppose, in a kind of gruesome exercise, and the fact that this is a little like an anatomy theatre is entirely appropriate. We have first got to exhume the corpse, and then what you don't do in an anatomy theatre, we're going to try to breathe life into it. But of course, in such circumstances, and I don't want to sound too much like a coroner, we've got to identify the body. The essential starting point, if we're to argue for the life or the death or the relevance or anything else of conservatism, is actually to try to identify it. It's an elusive and difficult thing. You may remember, and I was trying to look it up and I failed completely, who it is. I'm sure in an audience in a city as distinguished for its learning, especially now it's rather leftish learning, somebody can tell me the answer to my question, who was it who said that socialism is what the Labour Party says it is? Well, conservatism clearly is not what the Conservative Party has said it is. Otherwise, I'm afraid this lecture would be over immediately. So what I've decided to do is to turn to the great figures that are invoked first by the current title of these lectures, that's to say, Michael Oakeshott, and then I shall shift from Oakeshott to what they used to be named after, Roger Scruton. After all, if Oakeshott and Scruton can't tell me what conservatism is, then maybe, following on from what Mark has said, David Starkey will have to supply the answer. So let's see how we get on. Here again, I was very interested in what Mark was saying there, with the emphasis on the idea of politics. That shift from where you were at the IEA to matters of, as it were, primarily economic policy, to the new world of popcorn, the much more vulgar, the much more down-to-earth, the occasionally colliding with real people. Now, nobody could ever, I knew in his extreme old age, I knew Michael Oakeshott, nobody could ever have accused Michael of colliding with real people. It was something that he avoided with sedulous efficacy, even in the senior common room of LSE, where admittedly there were not many specimens of real people. But shall we hear what he actually has to say on the subject of what is conservatism? To inject into the activities of already too passionate men an ingredient of moderation, to restrain, to deflate, to pacify, and to reconcile, not to stoke the fires of desire, but to damp them down. I hope I've depressed you sufficiently. It also strikes me as perhaps that wouldn't be the best way that one would describe another seminal text of conservatism, Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. I think there's quite a lot of desire. There is more passion. So I fear you made a terrible mistake in changing the title of the lectures. Michael is not going to help us very far, is he? And again, what is a very striking thing about Oakeshott, he would not be surprised at my dismissal. He thought politics was a rather low-level activity. Human beings could be occupied in different and better things. I disagree. Like Aristotle, like the Greek tradition, I think politics is central, and I think it's architectonic. That is to say, it shapes, and it shapes the rest. Let me now turn to Roger Scruton, after whom these lectures were named. Now, Roger has a quite extraordinary reputation. He must be the only academic after whom cafes are named throughout Eastern Europe. Quite seriously. There are images of them on display. They are holy relics. I mean, they actually buy a Scruton bust, a little bit like that of Jesus or assorted Spanish saints or whatever. So he has a profound symbolic role. None of us should either forget what he did in the days when Eastern Europe was still dominated by communism. None of us should forget his courage and his personal bravery, and doing what very few of us have ever done, which is not simply talking about politics, but actually participating in it, in the rescue of the oppressed and those suffering under communism. And it is, of course, something that his great disciple, Douglas Murray, is doing now in the Middle East. This commands respect. So let's listen to what he actually says with that sense that it's worth listening to. Our Constitution, sorry, forgive me, I'm jumping over. Conservatives believe that our identities and values are formed through our relations with other people and not through our relations with the state. The state is not an end, but a means. Civil society is the end, and the state is only a means to protect it. The social world emerges through free association, rooted in friendship and community life. And the customs and institutions that we cherish have grown from below by the invisible hand of cooperation. They have rarely been imposed from above by the work of politics, the role of which, for a conservative, is simply to reconcile our many aims and not to dictate or control them. terribly keen on politics either, is he? And if you continue with that brief, forgive me, that brief but very interesting essay, you will find some other rather interesting things. Of course, as you would expect, having mentioned state and civil society, he then goes on to talk in passionate terms about the family. Now, what are these terms? State, civil society, and family. These are, of course, the terms of the Hegelian dialectic, as most fully developed in the philosophy of right. They are the family as the thesis, the civil society as the antithesis, and the state as the synthesis. In other words, and this is something very striking, Roger, who presented himself as quintessentially English, that soaking in the English landscape, that sense of place, that sense of fox hunting, that belief in the great English historical tradition, his devotion, at least to the idea of common law, he actually reads in the Inns of Court at one point of his life, is nevertheless, and this seems to me to be something that has to be said, and has to be said clearly, hopeless as a guide to actual politics, because he is soaked in what I regard as the treacherous waters of German idealism. And I can think of no worse foundation for seriously trying to understand anything apart from Wagner, which he was also extremely good at. Now, this matters. And it also, I think, it's very important that we try and be serious about some of the other things that Roger says. For example, when he emphasizes the importance of community, when he emphasizes the importance particularly of the family, in this sense that there is, this great family tradition. Actually, in England, there isn't. Let us be quite frank on this. The work of the Cambridge Population Group, I apologize for mentioning the other place, but the work of Peter Laslett in the work that we have lost, in the world that we have lost, demonstrates conclusively that the English family is peculiarly weak in its structure, that the English family is right from the earliest known records, is in fact a proto-nuclear family. There are not extended families. This means, of course, also that, again, setting Roger's constant emphasis, not on the individual, but the community, the group, this itself is profoundly misleading. England is individualistic almost again from the beginning. There's a wonderful book by Alan Macfarlane, which I would strongly recommend that we all read, which is called simply The Origins of English Individualism. And it begins with the Anglo-Saxons. It actually begins with Tacitus' description of an Anglo-Saxon encampment and their preference for loneliness in the countryside rather than living in communities and in cities as all civilized people do. In other words, the suburbia of Oxford goes back to the mists of the German Fenland, and the shores of the North Sea. Now, all of this, I think, raises absolutely fundamental questions. Another one, which again rises profoundly from Scruton's work, is this idea of the unconscious creation of law, or if you like, the emanation of law, rather in the fashion of the hidden hand of Adam Smith in the analogous work on the free market. Here again, there's another German lying there, and that is a German whom I have much higher opinion of than Hegel, although his name also begins with an H. It is Hayek. Hayek again believed profoundly that separate from politics, there is a different and higher realm of self-generated law. I think this is nonsense and dangerous. If my idea of the architectonic quality of politics is right, law and politics and society are all as one. So we need a different model. We need to look elsewhere. Where shall we find it? Well, ladies and gentlemen, you're sitting in it. You're sitting in this building, created in the immediate aftermath of one of the very greatest events in English history, which is the restoration of the monarchy and Parliament after the civil wars, and indeed the execution of the king of the middle of the 17th century. This is a building modelled on an Athenian theatre, which itself is modelled on the characteristic space of the assembly of the Athenian people. And we need to do something radical. We need to consider the idea that was profoundly at the heart of this experience of this building, which is the idea, as I said, of politics as architectonic, and what I am doing now, the use of open speech before an interested and questioning audience, in other words, the idea of rhetoric, is absolutely central to that process. So what I want to do, I want to begin and to continue and to explore the idea of a constitution, the notion of the political structure of a state as a determining element of an entire society. And what I want to do, I want to begin with remember, as always, almost always in our culture, where it begins is ancient Greece and usually ancient Athens. The whole notion, which again has been purveyed by some very serious people, that our political culture, indeed our general culture, is Judeo-Christian, seems to me to be fundamentally misconceived. Our political culture, as the very language, the words that we actually use demonstrates, is not Judeo-Christian, it is Greco-Roman. And until we actually understand that fact, we will get nowhere. So what is the ur-text? What is the moment at which the ideas that I wish to discuss with you this evening and wish to see as the anchorage of proper conservatism, what is the moment at which they are first and most clearly expressed? Well, it is, of course, and I'm sure many of you are actually waiting for it, it is the great speech in Thucydides at the height of the Peloponnesian War, when Pericles pronounces the requisite oration over the actual dead, the Athenians who've fallen in war. That greatest speech of antiquity, which I'm afraid, of course, was the model for Boris Johnson to bring us down to reality. But as we will see, the original is considerably better in this case than the imitation. Let's begin with the first paragraph. After he's invoked the dead bodies, after he'd invoked the ancestors, after he'd invoked the heroism, remember all the things that we do in the great height of empire in the 18th century when we construct Valhallas like St. Paul's, Westminster Abbey, in the 19th century, the National Portrait Gallery. So the worship of ancestors. Let's now come to when he turns to why this comparatively small city is the model. He actually uses the idea, the model to Greece and to the world. And he begins with the key word. Our constitution is called a democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority, but of the whole people. Where it is a question of settling private disputes, everyone is equal before the law. When it is a question of putting one person before another in positions of public responsibility, what counts is not membership of a particular class, but the actual ability which a man possesses. No one, so long as he has it in him to be of service to the state, is kept in political obscurity because of poverty. And just as in our political life it is free and open, so our day-to-day life in our relations with each other is the same. The political and the personal are the same. We do not get into a state with our next-door neighbor if he enjoys himself in his own way. We're tolerant. But nor do we give him the kind of black looks which, though they cause no real harm, still do hurt people's feelings. We don't cancel. We are free and tolerant in our private lives, but in public affairs we keep the law. This is because it is our law, and as such it commands our deep respect. We give our obedience to those whom we put in positions of authority, and we obey the laws themselves, especially those which are for the protection of the oppressed, and those unwritten laws which it is an acknowledged shame to break. you see the clear linkage of the idea of a political constitution and of a series of social and democratic norms, patterns of behavior, openness. And he then goes on, of course, and he talks about a city which has a wealth, but a wealth that it uses properly, that this kind of society is one that enables wealth to be accumulated. He talks about the festivals, he talks about the celebrations, he talks about a particular attitude to war, in which you don't have a society which is constantly in a state of fear, like Sparta, in which there is vicious training which dominates the whole of life, but nevertheless, because it is their own, because you share, because you are part of it, you fight for it as nobly and as courageously, in just the same way that it's brilliantly argued by a very considerable German historian and a former student of mine called Ronald Asch, that 18th century England actually invents the idea of the hero. That is one who will die for the benefit of all. France cannot have heroes. It's only got one. It's the king. Why we have so many statues. So, that sense there, what it seems to me is that this is the dominant idea of our politics. If you look at Aristotle's Politics, you will see that he develops this idea, and he doesn't just analyze clearly the democratic or the mixed constitution of Athens. He looks at monarchical constitutions. He looks at tyrannical constitutions. In other words, he sees the politics as forming different kinds of societies. And the flows from that analyses, praises of specific constitutions, always the idea of the constitution. One of the texts that is unfortunately largely missing, but we know everything about it, is Cicero's great foundational text on the Roman Republic, written in its actual dying days, as I may be offering this invocation to English conservatism, simply at an exactly similar moment, Cicero's De Republica. And then at the other end of the scale, de Tocqueville's Democracy in America is directly modeled on Pericles' great oration. He is consciously writing with that model in mind as he explores the democratic personality in America and sees the Constitution, that thing which founds America, as shaping, as reshaping, as remodeling, not simply a society, but a man, a kind of species of human being. I want to take that as my foundational text and my foundational idea. So I want to look then at the idea of the English Constitution as what we as conservatives should be conserving. Nobody has come up with a sensible answer to what on earth conservatives is supposed to be conserving. I mean, let me look at somebody who is competing to be, and probably will be, the new leader of the Conservative Party. I must remember to say Badenoch on the grounds of nothing bad in Badenoch. Right. What is the kind of her definition of conservatism? Our party's values of personal responsibility, a belief in family, freedom through opportunity, and so much more. A shoppingness. Unformed, unthought through, unstructured, baseless. Would you die for a shopping list? Would you vote for a shopping list? Well, you all did, didn't you, the last time? And look where that got us. But there we are. What is it? 5 missions in government or so, isn't it? Right. I want to explore then the idea of the English Constitution, and I want to claim something rather radical. We discussed this. I want to tread in particular on as many toes in this university as possible. Because this university is, of course, its entire 19th century structure was founded on 2 things. It was founded on Jowett and Graetz and the whole study of the classics. But on the other hand, it was founded on Stubbs's great constitutional history of England. in which it presents the constitutional history of England as this splendid example of Whig progress, marching on from great moment to great moment until it culminates in the marvelous triumph of Victorian England. The Victorians, unlike us, have that marvelous quality of confidence. They knew they were best, and on the whole, they were right. But what I want to do is to present pretty much that same story. And I emphasize this. The only point on which I've ever agreed with Simon Schama was on one occasion when we sat down and talked. We said, well, pretty much we agree that the Whig account of English history is pretty well right. But it's not, you know, because it's a conservative account. The English Constitution and its development, and actually development is fundamentally the wrong word, is essentially the story, not of progress, not of reaction, but of careful conservatism, of cherishing what was there, of a great historical tradition, which you do modify, but as Disraeli said, towards the end of that process that we're talking about now, as Disraeli said so brilliantly, we are a progressive country. There is no question that we will change. The question is how. Do you change according to the traditions of your country, or do you do something else? Do you invoke abstract, internationalist, liberal doctrines? Because Disraeli, unlike the Conservative Party of David Cameron, knew who the enemy was. It was the liberal. It was the liberal middle class. So I then want to offer you this, what I hope is a very different account of how we should understand the English Constitution. And I want us to begin very early. Conventionally, as of course Stubbs did, I want us to begin very early. Again, and it's a doctrine which is subscribed to, of all people, by Scruton, there is this notion that conservatism is merely reactive, that it only comes in with the French Revolution and the desire to conserve once the Ancien regime is threatened by that terrible wave of blood and fire and destruction, which arguably has never fully died down. I think this fundamentally gets it wrong. I think when, again, in the 19th century, when they rebuilt after the Great Fire, which destroyed the Palace of Westminster, when they rebuilt the modern Palace of Westminster, with a deliberate instruction to the architects that it could not be in the classical style, it had to be in the Gothic or the Tudor, they were right. Our Constitution is genuinely historically founded. There is a direct line of continuity, and Mark has already mentioned my little book on Magna Carta. There really is a direct line to 1215, or rather, it's not the part, again, to be a little controversial, it's not the Charter of 1215, which is a genuinely radical, indeed revolutionary, indeed republican document. It is the wonderful conservative charter which is magicked out of nothing by our first great conservative politician, William the Marshal, in 1216. That is where it all begins, and it's finally finished off by the constant reissues of Magna Carta in 1225, when in 1225 the charter is reissued, not simply to the free, but to everybody. It is reissued to everybody in England because everybody had paid a grant to the king. In other words, the first clear example of taxation in return for the redress of grievance, and therefore the granting of something by the king, which of course is then the model for what follows. So I want to begin with what I regard as the moment at which those forces that I've described there, as it were, acquire self-consciousness. And it seems to me to be one of the central texts of English history that receives far too little attention. It's John Fortescue's The Governance of England. And in The Governance of England, it's a tiny little thing, first written almost certainly for the Lancastrian Prince of Wales in exile in France, to whom Fortescue was tutor, and then reworked possibly for the restored Henry VI, and certainly to be put in the hands of the re-restored Edward IV. Politics were real then, and they were very complicated, but happily we needn't go into it too much. And what Fortescue does in that, again drawing in his experiences in France, like, again, as we saw with Pericles, as we know Aristotle did, he draws generalizations from actual observable experience. In other words, the English inductive method. What is very striking, this is not a text about ideals. This is not a text about ideas. It has, of course, various texts that it cites, which are entirely fictitious. Bits and pieces of the Bible and the history of Brutus and whatever, complete nonsense. What it really is, it's its own times. It's a kind of Neil Ferguson of its own times. And what he does, he identifies two different kinds of monarchy, the monarchy of France and the monarchy of England. The monarchy of France he calls dominium regale, a royal realm, a royal dominion. The monarchy of England, and again he's identifying the constitution of the two countries, he calls a dominium politicum et regale, a royal and political kingdom or dominion, or whatever we want to call it. How does he judge between these two things? He uses, again, I've talked about the English method. He uses an empirical test. He doesn't ask whether one of these is better in the sight of God. He doesn't ask whether one of them corresponds to the greater natural order. He doesn't invent a false language for them. He asks a very simple question: which one makes you better off? It is, I would say, it is really an early example of utilitarianism. And he draws, of course, on the biblical text. I've always said Jesus was a whiz at politics, even if less effective at theology. That marvelous phrase, by their fruits ye shall know them. That key text, in other words, look at what something does. And what he says quite simply is, in France, the king can take what he wants from you. The result of that is a rich king and miserably poor people. And he describes vividly and accurately the state of the French peasantry. He talks about their miserable dress, about their bare legs, about their diet, which barely includes meat. It would be very fashionable today. It is largely veg with a tiny smattering of lard when they're allowed it. He talks about the wretchedness of their dwellings. And he compares that, accurately we know, with the wealth and the prosperity, and above all, the widely distributed prosperity of England. And he identifies it with the simple fact: the king in England cannot take what you have. In other words, there is a law and there is property, and the one protects the other. But he grounds it firmly. You've got to go back here. He doesn't mention Parliament a lot, but it's there in the back, because what he's really wanting to do, and I needn't go into the detail, he's wanted to provide for a non-parliamentary means of actually founding the monarchy. In other words, making sure that it's not subject, that you don't have to pay for it. It's very modern. It's kind of privatized monarchy. Margaret Thatcher would have loved it. He's also aware of something else. He is aware why France is in the mess that it is and England isn't. He points out that in the reign of St. Louis, a century or two before he's writing, in the 15th century, France had a representative assembly called the Three Estates. Consent was needed for taxation. But in the great struggle of the 100 Years' War and the repeated defeats of France, it became impossible to summon the Estates General, and the public emergency allowed Charles VII to impose arbitrary and increasingly savage taxation, but also to do something else, to destroy any sense of the burden falling equally. I made that point about that Magna Carta of 1225, tax paid by everybody. In France, the nobility is exempt from taxation. Once you actually cease to summon the Estates General, only, as it were, it's a kind of ideal conservative vision, isn't it? Only the poor pay tax. And as you notice, in much of Europe, that remains the case, where it's really regarded as being positively a sign of bad manners to pay tax. But that, I think, governs much of Italy, in my experience, but there we are. But the important thing is, so see what he's saying. Parliament is not something progressive. The French had a parliament, and they lost it in the name of efficiency. And this is, in other words, this seems to me to be the foundational conservative element. He knew that what they had inherited was the guarantor of their freedom. The idea, which is the great idea of the Oxford School in the 19th century, the Tubman School, that this is something that's being moved towards, is wrong. It's something that is being deliberately conserved from the past. Let me highlight another few things that I think are very important with Fortescue. That dominium politicum et regale. Political, we were talking about it, the Greek term, and royal. In other words, it's a royal republic. But what I think is important to recognize is the potential tension between the royal and the republican elements. That's to say, a monarchy which is about the king's will, and another form of monarchy which is about the king as the representative of, if you like, a constitutional monarch who is the guarantor of political normalcy and incorporates in himself the representative element. So that seems to me to be where we start. We need to understand then that the constitutional ideal, which is in the background of Fortescue, is there. It's not something to which we move. It's something that's actually got to be defended, and it's got to be preserved. There's another feature of it, which is very remarkable, which is positive anti-religiousness. The book ends, believe it or not, with a parody of a prayer. The essential purpose of Fortescue is to endow the monarchy with land. The usual form that endowment took in the 15th century was to endow the colleges of Oxford or any other form of ecclesiastical building. He ends with a parody prayer that is to be sung by the assembled people of England because they become a college, they become an endowed monarchy, so they don't have to pay taxes anymore. And ladies and gentlemen, it's worth listening to this on Budget Day. The prayer is as follows: God save King Edward, who has made sure we don't have to pay taxes. That's the basis. That is written into a 15th century text. That mockery of the idea that we should be offering up hymns to God for the afterlife, for purgatory and whatever. The sheer daring of this. So what is it then that we are actually preserving? What is it that matters so much? It seems to me that what we have there is a clear idea, again, going back to Magna Carta, of a government in which the governed and the governors fuse. They fuse through the idea of a parliament which binds everybody, because everybody is represented there in person or by his representative, in which the pooling of wealth for the common purpose can only be done by a vote, in which laws can only properly be made there. So, isn't this, A, strikingly similar to the vision which is offered by Pericles? And isn't it strikingly similar to every notion that we have of our own free, ordered, or at least until recently, law-based society? And it seems to me that it really is, but with, again, that dominant role, that architectonic that organizing role attributed to politics. Let's now just quickly look at how all of that rolls forward. It rolls forward, it seems to me, in several ways. In the 16th century, again, this idea of the Constitution, you see it, those denouncing the English Constitution, like Thomas More in Utopia, with an opposed tradition which becomes dominant with Thomas Eliot and Thomas Smith in the De Republica Anglorum, obviously derived from Cicero. One of them, More arguing that the English Commonwealth is unjust, and Eliot and Thomas Smith arguing that it is just. The two of them, the two sides of the debate, of course, reflecting the debate, as it were, at some distance of time between Cicero on the one hand and St. Augustine on the other. St. Augustine arguing in the City of God in the wake of the first fall of Rome that Rome had never been a just society. Therefore, it was unfair to blame the Christians for the fall of Rome. That's one tradition. That's the tradition, if you like, public debate of propaganda. But there's another very different tradition, isn't there? What do the English actually do with this inherited tradition? What do they do with this notion which had guaranteed their prosperity, the idea of parliament or parliamentary approval for taxation? How do they defend it? How is it attacked? I think it's also very important to recognize that there is a moment when something novel happens. The novelty happens in my own period, here we'll now have Cambridge rather than Oxford. The novelty happens in the 1530s with what was famously described by my own great teacher, by Geoffrey Elton, as the Tudor Revolution. I've already argued the idea of Parliament is an old-fashioned idea. It's a primitive idea. It's a medieval idea. Efficiency in the 16th century got rid of Parliament. The French were hyper-efficient. It's a form of government which you can deploy huge resources. You can maintain standing armies, which the English were never able to do. And what happens in the reign of Henry VIII is indeed, as Geoffrey said, it's a Tudor revolution. You create new instruments of state. You create the Privy Council, you create the secretaryship, all the sorts of things that were going on in continental Europe. But what that does, and Geoffrey got this wrong, what that does, it immensely strengthens the power of the king. It immensely strengthens the regale aspect of the Constitution. In other words, the Tudor Revolution is the exact opposite of what poor old Geoffrey said. It makes the monarchy very much stronger. On the other hand, thanks probably to Cromwell, what England does not do is abolish the old political side. And it's symbolized by the two palaces which emerge in Tudor England, the Palace of the King, the Palace of Power, the Palace of Regale, which is Whitehall, and the Palace of Parliament, which is the old Palace of Westminster, which is the old palace of, if you like, the medieval idea of the king under the law. And I would argue that those two ideas conflict with each other right through the 16th and 17th century, and they do in fact form the two sides in the Civil War, which is not fought as we so often think, between Republican and monarchist. It is, on the contrary, fought between two different views of monarchy. Monarchy in which the king is the actual driver of the state, and the other in which he is something very different, in which he is the representative of legal order, what we might call constitutional monarchy. But that's to jump into the middle of the 17th century. Let's quickly look at 1603. Let's look at the moment of the succession of the Stuarts and the proffer of union between England and Scotland, which is passionately wanted by James I. It is rejected by the English because creating the new state of Britain would destroy their liberties. It would destroy the liberties of the English Constitution. In other words, the rejection of union in 1603 is a profoundly conservative act. What is that civil war? The resistance to Charles I, which I've already talked about when I've contrasted the dominium regale aspect of England and the dominium politicum aspect of England. What is that civil war is fought, I would argue, we normally think of the Puritans, we normally think of the parliamentarians as the radicals. They're not. They are the conservatives. It's the royalists who are the innovators in politics and religion. It's only after the death of the king, it's only with the triumph of Cromwell that something very different emerges. And how is that solved in 1660? As I said at the beginning, it is solved quite consciously, quite consciously. It is solved by going back, by undoing the profoundly conservative element. And similarly, with the Glorious Revolution that follows the attempts of the imposition, yet again, of a dominium regale by James II, interestingly using resources which are very similar to what I'm going to talk about shortly, the interpenetration of politics by law and the use of law as an instrument of absolutism. And in 1689, it is all undone by the Glorious Revolution. And you may have seen an article in the Times today by Danny Finkelstein for One Speaking Sense. And he is, without a rabbi joke, and he is there invoking a recent study which argues that the entire financial and political and military success of England is due to that settlement of 1689, that profoundly conservative settlement of 1688-89. I would say, yes, of course that is actually true, but it goes back to Fortescue. It goes back to the reign of Edward I. It goes back to Magna Carta. It is that continuing conservative tradition. So there we are. There's also something else that needs to be said. When does it end? What I've identified, and what I hope I've identified, is the idea of a conservative tradition, the idea of the centrality of the Constitution, the centrality of politics, all of those things that I've described there, the struggles, the struggles of the great medieval kings, the accession of James II, of James I, the struggles against Charles I, the revolution of the middle of the 17th century. These are profoundly political acts, shaping and reshaping and determining whether that inheritance that I've talked about will actually survive. What does it all result in? What is, as we've now rejected Stubbs, what is the culmination of it all? Well, the culmination of it all, it seems to me, is another very great Oxford figure. A very great Oxford figure indeed, I would argue much greater than Stubbs. It's A.V. Dicey. Dicey's great work on the Constitution, the law of the Constitution, identifies, as it were, what structurally emerged from all of that. What structurally emerged from all of that was, of course, the centrality of Parliament, which he puts in very simple terms, very straightforward terms, as the idea of sovereignty, of parliamentary sovereignty. And Dicey, of course, is writing at exactly the moment in which the final great conservative contribution to that had been made. Remember, the great struggle of the 19th century is whether the historic constitution of England could survive modernity and democratization. And the answer is a resounding yes. 1832 is, of course, forced on conservatism through its gritted teeth by characteristic devices of the threat of creation of peers, the twisting of the king's arm, and all the rest of it. But with the Tamworth Manifesto of 1835, what do you find? You find the conservative leader Peel embracing it and endorsing it and saying he will go with it. And then you find, astonishingly, in the later 19th century, you find Disraeli recognizing that the only hope of saving conservatism, which had been nearly killed by the triumph of the highly educated middle-class electorate that's created by the 1832 Reform Act, is to broaden the franchise and to continue to broaden the franchise until at the beginning of the 20th century, in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, we have for the first time a genuine democracy. But remember, before that point, we had had what really mattered. We had had representative government. We'd had secure property rights. We had abundant freedom. We had a known system of law and all the rest of it. All that happens is that that idea of parliamentary representation proves to be sufficiently flexible. And do remember, it is truly astonishing when the other great account of the 19th century Constitution is written by Bagehot. Bagehot had no European comparator. There was no European state that enjoyed anything like representative government. He had to look to America. So that's fine and dandy. That is the basis, if you like, of our 19th century success, 18th, 19th century success, of that extraordinary world that you will find, of course, represented in the realities of 19th century achievement, of the Industrial Revolution, but you'll also find wonderfully set out in, for example, Thornhill's ceiling, painted in the immediate aftermath of 1689 at Greenwich, in which you see a vision exactly like the vision of Pericles. You see a vision of a state which is free, open, secure, which is prosperous, which is open to the world, and which invokes the arts and sciences and ceremony and music and astronomy and every mechanics, every other art you can imagine, all there, all contributing to the glory of England. And in the center, the king under the law, occasionally a little reluctantly, William III, trampling the supreme master of the Dominium Regale, Louis XIV, under his feet. So why are we in the present mess? I have tried to give you an account of English history which suggests a fundamental conservatism. At every moment of crisis, the instinct is to go back, is to conserve. What has gone wrong? Well, what it seems to me has gone wrong, very simply, is this, that quite deliberately, from 1997 onwards, we decided to tear apart that Constitution and all the guarantors that I've offered. In other words, what we need to do, ladies and gentlemen, we need to register that we are actually living genuinely through radical times. And we need, forgive me, I'm just the awful business of scrabbling for notes, I apologize. We need to understand that something revolutionary has happened. And by the way, when I say revolutionary, I'm quoting. I am quoting, astonishingly, a Guardian journalist. I don't often. In December 2004. He talks of, there's an heading to an article, the radical who is leading a new English revolution. And he identifies the senior law lord, Lord Bingham. I would suggest that he's right. And I will, in a moment, look in some detail at the judicial revolution. But what I'd like to do first is to present a very, very quick overview of what's happened. In the background, what I want to, again, the big point that I want to make, in precisely the way that that old English Constitution, the one whose praises are sung so wonderfully and so eloquently by Fortescue in the Governors of England. That old English constitution, which guaranteed an extraordinary level of prosperity. The evidence is quite clear. The English right through, from the High Middle Ages, right through to the end of the 19th century, enjoy a higher living standard than any other European country. We are the first place, actually, to abolish dearth and poverty with the agricultural revolution of the 18th century. So there is that thing that guaranteed it, that made sure that we didn't have a rich king and a poor people, is, in my view, under sustained, continuous, and possibly fatal attack from 1997. Let me try and highlight the various things that happened. The first thing is, as we know, you introduce the idea of devolution for Scotland. It's rather interesting. I've already praised Dicey and his notions of the law of the Constitution. The central point in Dicey is that what makes English common law great isn't the operations of some mysterious self-governing mechanism as Scruton and as Hayek think. It's politics and power. What makes law universal in medieval England uniquely is the power of the English monarchs, which are actually able to force everybody to submit to it. What means that what is there, which makes sure that there is no exception for rank, is again that power. What means that that law extends over the whole of England is the power of the monarchy that can suppress franchises, that can reduce border raiders, that can eliminate clannishness. And this is power. It's the fact that there is a unitary force. The first thing that Labour does is deliberately to break up that force. Not for nothing was Dicey passionately opposed to Home Rule for Ireland. And if you look at the legacy of Stormont, could we not have realized what devolution would lead to? That it would automatically entrench sectarianism, it would create toy-town government, it would create a world that simply divides and diminishes. So you begin that process. The next thing that you do is begin the creation of a whole series of quangos that have removed fundamental aspects of decision-making from this single body of Parliament, which up to that point had genuinely made major law. You create, first of all, and we're seeing the terrible consequences of this, you give the Bank of England control over the most important single instrument, the setting of interest rates. Now, once upon a time, that was regarded as a huge success. The last 14 years and the soaring of public debt, the extraordinary accumulated asset inflation and so on, should convince us that, in fact, it's been a catastrophe. And then you go on and you multiply other quangos, which means, in fact, that Parliament gets the blame, but takes almost none, actually has almost none of the power. The Climate Change Committee, huge importance. English nature, which actually determines where property can be built, and so on. So you create a deliberate move from the elected, from those in Parliament, that you and I can vote for and you and I can get out, as was demonstrated in the near-fatal experience of the Conservative Party earlier this year. You deliberately replace them with the unelected. But there are two other things which are vastly more important, I think. And here we come, actually, to that revolution, that radical that we're talking about with Lord Bingham. You incorporate the European Convention of Human Rights into English law, and you then, at the beginning of the New Labour period, you then, in 2005, you remove the law lords from the upper house, from the House of Lords, and you create the Supreme Court, and you take down the role of Lord Chancellor, and then finally you pass the Equalities Act. All of this has the effect of an absolute fundamental transfer of power away from Parliament, away from you and me, who actually elect it, to completely unknown sphere. And it's that sphere which I actually want to look at and to try to understand in more detail. The creating of the Supreme Court, of course, the very name creates an immediate tension, judicial tension, between a parliament which claims to be sovereign and a court that calls itself supreme. We saw it in the extraordinary business of ruling the prorogation of parliament illegal. Forgive me, sorry, my throat. But the more important, that I will address in a moment, but you also do something else. With the incorporation of the European Convention on Human Rights, you actually erode the very concepts of nationhood, of citizenship, and indeed, I would argue, actually of rights. I mean, think about it. If human rights are universal, or if they're European, it means that there is somebody, not you, who endorses them. It means there's a form of law which Parliament is not responsible for. The reason that we have had, on the whole, very high levels of public order in this country, that we can have things like policing by consent, is above all because law is by consent. Everybody is bound by what is decided in Parliament because everybody is represented there. It was a fiction in the Middle Ages. It is a reality with a democratic franchise. But the idea of universal human rights introduces another legal authority. It introduces something different. And finally, the Equalities Act is really something else completely. As we've seen, there is this extraordinary inversion, the inversion of what sounds a good thing and the turning of it into something actually profoundly dangerous. And the profoundly dangerous with the Equality Act is, of course, it's all about inequality. If you privilege certain specific groups, the rest of us are left behind. Now, that's me. That's my very quick summary. A deliberate creation of a world in which Parliament exercises very little direct power. And can I suggest we've had an extraordinary example of it today. The infinite contempt for Parliament demonstrated by this government that has leaked every detail of the budget in a fashion which breaks every convention and rule. And we have it also from the mouth of Keir Starmer. Parliament is just a talking shop. I prefer to be at Davos. This entire reversal of the Constitution as it's outlined by Dicey. But now let's just quickly, and I will conclude here before we go to our discussion, can I just look a little bit more carefully at what I think is the foundation of all of this. The foundation of all of this, and the thing that really sustains it, is something, again, which sounds absolutely wonderful. I've suggested that the great determinant of our success, the great determinant of the Constitution of England, that Constitution jealously and conservatively preserved, was politics, with a particular form of political activity in a representative assembly. We have now replaced this by something completely different. The rule of the people through Parliament has now been replaced by the idea of the rule of law. The myth that we are now laboring under is there is this thing called the rule of law. And can we now just look at what this rule of law actually entails? Well, it is, again, the centerpiece of all of this is Lord Bingham. I've mentioned this extraordinary process, which is terribly random when you look at it, how those dates scatter on either side of those 13 years of Labour in power. But there's one moment at which it's all really triggered and formulated. How can you come up with an idea of so fundamentally important, or as the rule of law, actually effectively replacing the rule of Parliament? But it's really very interesting. Historians love dates. I mentioned the dethroning of the office of Lord Chancellor, that man who enjoyed the extraordinary prerogative of being head of the judiciary, of chairing, of acting as a rather relaxed chair of the House of Lords, and had a seat in the cabinet. He was abolished because, of course, he defied the separation of powers, and he defied the separation of powers, and New Labour didn't like that at all, and he was replaced by the present mishmash. Indeed, Charlie Faulkner, who led the attack on the position of Lord Chancellor, wanted to abolish the office completely, and then they found it was mentioned in about 2,000 statutes, and they couldn't actually do it. But they've drafted a new oath for the Lord Chancellor. The Lord Chancellor was actually to swear to do what? He was to swear to uphold the rule of law. They then discovered that not only they didn't know what the Lord Chancellor actually did, they actually didn't know what the rule of law was. This all happened in 2005. The new office of Lord Chancellor, with this swearing the oath, was introduced in 2006, at which point Lord Bingham gave a lecture in which he defined the rule of law in Cambridge. He did so, ladies and gentlemen, as far as I can see, in an entirely arbitrary fashion. He declared that there were 8 points which included the rule of law. The first was human rights. And then he is actually really quite explicit, and he's totally frank about what human rights means. Let me tell you what is incorporated into the idea of, let's just find them, what is actually incorporated by human rights. It must be nonetheless accepted, this is Lord Bingham, that any Charter or Bill of Rights is undemocratic in that it is counter-majoritarian. Its purpose is to give a measure of protection to minorities who lack the strength of the representation to obtain protection through the political process. Prisoners, mental patients, gypsies, homosexuals, asylum seekers, despised racial or religious minorities, and the like. In other words, it's not designed to protect your rights. It's designed to protect the rights of minorities. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there is not a single thing in the actual text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations or of the European Convention which bears that construction at all. This is a pure piece of judicial fantasy. And of course, it's profoundly dangerous, isn't it? Because we have now something else, don't we? We have racial doctrines, we have the various campaigns for racial justice, which similarly identify the minority, racial minorities, sexual minorities, as better than the majority. We've actually reversed. So what Bingham did, and what this rule of law, which is now regarded as the absolute centerpiece of government, does, it actually is deliberately anti-majoritarian. This is why we've actually got to invent a new word. We can no longer talk about democracy, because democracy originally meant, didn't it, the rule of the majority. We've now decided that democracy incorporates the rule of law, which protects minorities. So we've got to have a new word. It's called populism, which means exactly what democracy used to mean, except we've swapped Latin for a bit of Greek. Let's continue with this extraordinary exercise of reinvention, which was carried out. He declares also that we must have international law as part of the rule of law. Ladies and gentlemen, international law is an absolute fiction. It is based around the assertions of a handful of lawyers and an increasingly implausible organization called the United Nations, as we can see the current state of the United Nations. So we have incorporated, thanks to Lord Bingham, an obligation to international law at exactly the moment when it doesn't work. And if you want to understand the consequences of that, look at the Chagos Islands. Look at the fact that the Falklands are about to go. We've substituted any notion of a national interest for instant subordination to whatever whim happens to sweep over a tiny, tiny group of people who call themselves international lawyers. But there's something even worse, isn't it? Again, this opens, as we can see very clearly, to the threats of reparations for slavery and so on. And then again, all equal before the law. Yes, absolutely. How is that construed? It is construed to mean the rule of law allows no discrimination between a British national and others. How on earth can that possibly be? Is he actually saying, and indeed he is saying, and this is what we see, that if you endeavour to distinguish between British nationals and any random immigrant who happens to come to our shore, the law lords will actually overrule you. Now, it seems to me to be something simply extraordinary has happened. And then finally, he finishes, and the reputation of Bingham, who is a product of this university, for a razor-sharp mind, I've never understood. He finishes with an extraordinary disquisition on the relationship of law and society. And he looks at the relationship of governed and governed, which begins with a rumination on the unbridled freedom enjoyed by Adam in the Garden of Eden before the creation of Eve. And I think this probably excited him, as the consequence that he draws from that is that the thing that mediates between the state and the citizen are judges. The rule of law becomes the rule of lawyers. And it could never, ever be anything else. When you think about it, what else could it actually be? And the striking thing, the thing that leaves me astonished, is if you look at the kind of sources that he actually quotes at the beginning, you get this immense enthusiasm for Tom Paine, saying that, you know, in an absolute monarchy, the king is the law. In a free society, the law is king, and there shall be no other. Now, that's a very peculiar thing for a Chief Justice or Supreme Court, the head of the the senior law lord. It's a very peculiar thing to say when you've actually got a king. And think about it. If law is king, what does that actually mean? It means that the law is superior over the executive and the legislative. Now, I would just argue, and I'm going to stop in a moment because I've gone on longer than I wish to have done. I'm going to argue that this represents something profoundly and deeply dangerous. This is the culmination of that drift from 1997 onwards, away from Parliament, away from our representatives, towards a series of unelected and self-empowered elites. But the thing, ladies and gentlemen, that is most terrible is this doctrine of the rule of law. What it means, frankly, is there's nothing you and I can do about it. And there's something even more frightening. It now is the driving force of the state. The specially appointed Attorney General, Lord Hermer, delivered a Bingham lecture lauding this. And there's something, I think, very frightening. Because what it means is actually, this again, it's this strange process of reversal. I've talked about the idea that if you declare universal human rights, it sounds lovely, but in fact, if they are the rights of the minority, they don't protect the rights of the majority at all. The only way you can protect the rights of increasingly extreme minorities is by bridling the freedoms of the majority, as we see vividly and clearly in what is happening to freedom of speech. But there's something which is genuinely terrifying. Bingham's view is the arch. It is the thing that binds together the new Labour settlement. And it is represented absolutely and firmly in the person of Keir Starmer, who is indeed an absolute product of this world. But the thing that is most frightening is it makes the judiciary the arm of a government. We have simply stood things on their head. If you like, and again, this is exactly what happened in 1689, if we have this idea of the separation of powers, yes, The executive must not interfere with judicial process. That is why in 1701 and again taken right through into the American Constitution, we declare that judges will hold position during good behavior and not at pleasure. In other words, judges effectively are appointed to life or to retiring age. Very good. But what we're seeing now is something I mentioned before. We're seeing a kind of reversion back to the reign of James II. We have judges behaving rather like Judge Jeffreys. If you actually look at the Bill of Rights, if you look at the attack on James II, James II functioned by turning law into an instrument of government. And I think we can see the consequences if we actually look now at how this government is behaving, how we are reacting to it. So very simply, the Conservative Constitution of Britain has been effectively destroyed. The only way we can rescue conservatism and Britain is by a comprehensive repeal of all the legislation that I have been talking about and a deliberate, sustained act of restoration. Thank you.
Well, David, thank you very much. A tour of 750 years of constitutional development and perhaps 25 years of constitutional vandalism in just an hour. I've got a few questions in the limited time we've got, just to tease out some of the themes you've been developing there. And I suppose the first to ask you, especially in your trot through 800 years of constitutional history and how the rules and the laws and the constitution of our country develops. How do we distinguish between something which is a mere modification, an upgrade, an evolution, almost a bit of spit and polish? One might put Disraeli's extension of the franchise in that category, compared to something that's vandalism, that takes it too far, isn't part of a natural process of constitutional evolution, but is actually breaking the underlying structure of the building, if you wanted to use that analogy. It's not clear to me how I can look back on the past 800 years of history and easily distinguish one from t'other.
What I think is striking, as I tried to emphasize, is how recognizable the English Constitution was up to the end of the 20th century. You can actually see it. You can see the elements, the traditions, the customs, and often absurd, that we laugh at, like taking a hostage to make sure that people come back. The
appointment of the speaker, you mean?
The dragging of the speaker to the chair, the striking on the door. Now, I think that's real, and there's something else I want to emphasize. These things that we laugh at, these constitutional conventions that we laugh at, ladies and gentlemen, that is the only reason we have a government at the moment. The government has returned with, let's quote the statistics again, 1 in 5 of the electorate voting for them, and with about 33%, or was it 36%, of those who actually did.
Yeah, 33.
In France, that leads to a major constitutional crisis. Here, because of our old conventions that who carries the majority of seats in the House of Commons forms a government, there were no Trumpian scenes. Rishi disappeared, maybe rejoicing, en route to California from Yorkshire, or whatever it was. And Starmer moved in, though mysteriously Lady Vic seems rather to have disappeared, presumably wearing some expensive dresses from Lord Ali. But ladies and gentlemen, this government mocks convention. This government mocks Parliament. The first thing that it's done is to seek to yet further diminish the House of Lords. But, ladies and gentlemen, it will find very shortly that the only thing that protects it is this surviving history, because it will have no democratic legitimacy whatever left. And it is the disaster of the Labour years was in the name of this shallow modernity, this belief in a new country. But what I'm arguing is Blair genuinely did deliver a new country. And again, he also transformed the population. He redefined the very notion of not simply the country, but the population, and he redefined something else. He redefined the very idea of citizenship. Remember, and again, it's something that it's a completely separate lecture, but what we need to look at is the fact that that union that was created between England and Scotland in 1707, why was that accepted? Because the essential structures of the Anglo-British polity were preserved. Scotland, indeed, joined its monarchy and its parliament with the English, but Scotland retained every other aspect of separate national identity, its own religion, its own educational system. The monarch changes religion or changes denomination as they cross the border, its currency issuing rights, its own universities, its own heraldry, its own crown jewels, the lot. All of that is there. So from the beginning, Britain was multinational, but there was this single dominant element of that conservative political tradition, constitutional, with the central role of the monarchy. And what Blair did deliberately was to sweep all that away and to replace it with a British identity that is a pure flag of convenience, because the only British values, as we know, are diversity and tolerance. In other words, it is meaningless, and we're reaping the terrible rewards.
Now, so you said at the outset of your lecture, David, that this was going to be, well, perhaps a bit of an autopsy, or that you might become a necromancer to be able to bring conservatism back to life. I mean, is conservatism really dead? The topic of this lecture was the strange death. Firstly, if it is dead, it doesn't seem particularly strange, its death. It's remarkably straightforward. A different type of government has altered the constitutional playing field.
But then, can I remind you, we had 14 years of what called itself a conservative government. And what it did was completely to fail to recognize what had happened, and indeed to embrace it, and indeed to reinforce it. This is the catastrophe. You had Cameron coming in saying, I am the heir of Blair. Michael Gove passes round marked up copies of Blair's memoirs as the new bloody Machiavelli. That's more or less
It's the strangeness of it that actually, although the Blairite constitutional change is revolutionary, the real strangeness of it is that the Conservatives have got along with this.
Well, they've actually reinforced it. I mean, this is something, again, that we really do need to understand. And we need to understand the terrible financial situation we're in. What I'm arguing is, in fact, the old constitution is why Britain was the first country to modernize, the astonishing... Remember, there's something very remarkable, isn't there? In 1660 and 1689, you deliberately go backwards, and we become easily the most advanced country in the world. See what I mean? There's a total paradox. In 1997, we embrace modernity, glottal stops, neo-Americanism, the whole lot, and we go tank downwards faster than any other country in the world. It's really important that we understand this. We've got to judge by results. And the disaster is, what did they do? They create the Office of Bloody Budget Responsibility, the Conservatives. They legislate, the idiot Theresa May, a product of this university, legislates the 2050 target into law for net zero. Do you realize, ladies and gentlemen, I talked about judicial overreach, the fact that the judges interfering in policy is at least as dangerous as the politicians interfering in the work of the judiciary. The judiciary now determine whether or not we can extract fossil fuels. We are in the even madder situation under the Equality Act. Does anybody realize what the Equality Act does? It legislates the Marxist labor theory of value. in 3 bizarre equations. And judges have ruled on the basis of that, on how do you equate the wages of a female cleaner and a male dustman. Now, it's deranged. Adam Smith tells you how to do it. You leave the market to fix the wages. No, judges do it, and they bankrupted Birmingham. And they're about to bankrupt next. This is deranged. But if we have this notion of a dominant rule of law, that's what we've got ourselves into.
Do you see, you were I thought very clear in your lecture, David, that it's 1997 and the rise of Blair where this all goes wrong.
Yeah.
But do you actually think that has antecedents? Might one argue, actually, that us embroiling ourselves in a whole range of international and multinational institutions pave the way for this? Is
the EU...
Yeah, is Blair not just the culmination of us having decided
Blair is an
EU?
intensification. That part of the Blair project was to assimilate us to the structures of continental government that are now seeing their triumphant realization in the economic collapse of Germany. Because that is actually what is going on. The German monolith is collapsing under precisely the sort of structures. I know, because we wrote them. The German constitution is essentially put together when the British in the occupation by the Allied forces at the end of the World War. The other thing is, of course, it's Lord Denning. It is the whole notion of judicial review. That and again, I can quote it from memory. Again, Martin Kettle most usefully summarizes all this, and he describes, again quoting Lord Bingham, that beginning with judicial review and entrenched with the European Convention on the incorporation of the European Convention into English law, the law lords, as they then were, this is even before the creation of the Supreme Court, become de facto a constitutional court. In other words, ruling on the legality or illegality of acts of parliament. Again, this is in complete defiance of the Bill of Rights. That essential settlement in 1688-89, reinforced by the actual act of settlement in 1701, drew an absolutely precise distinction between the sphere of politics and the sphere of law. And we have deliberately confused them. And we have made law dominant. The rule of law, ladies and gentlemen, can only mean the rule of lawyers. And it is, we see the evidence of it, of course, on the other side of the Atlantic.
So is everything lost? Is this the last shot on the board? Could we bear another 5 or 10 years of this? Is it relatively easy to actually hit the reset button when you want to? Or can such damage be done that when you hit that button,
it certainly can
work?
And I would have thought it is 75% certain that this catastrophe will continue. We are confronting major national collapse. We are on the route to Argentina. We really, really are. Look at the figures for borrowing. Look at the steady climb of interest rates. We are now paying double Germany. We've got to understand this. It will require a sense of rediscovery. But remember, let's look on the other side. The revolution of 1640 to 1660 was longer. It was more profound. You literally cut a king's head off. You aim to remake an entire society. And yet, why us historians haven't written about this in the proper way? We perform the most conservative act than any people has ever done. It's a real revolution. And in 1660, the English, primarily, decide to reverse it. And they decide to reverse it, not like the French at the end of the French Revolution, as a result of defeat and occupation by the Allied powers. We reverse it by ourselves.
And do you think, David, that are the British electorate, or at least a segment of the electorate, do you think, beginning to think in those terms? They might not articulate it in the form of a lecture delivered at the Sheldonian Theatre, but if you were to look for the vote for Brexit, for example,
Yeah.
caught the establishment greatly by surprise. There seems to be considerable unease about how the legal profession seems to be more of a determinant of our immigration and asylum policy than Parliament.
Absolutely.
Is there out there a feeling that the people want the reset button hit, do you think? Or is it too obscure?
No.
Actually, they're just sort of thinking really what matters is, you know, you've got to decide whether the blue team or the red team are the more competent people to run these various newfangled committees.
Well, that was, of course, the old view of people like Daniel Finkelstein. And it's the terrible consequence of PPE in Oxford. No degree has ever done more universal damage anywhere. It is superficial, it is shallow, it teaches petty manipulation. And a totally disgraceful and reductive view of politics. I'm being really serious. Really, really serious. And it's time something was done about it. He said, sounding like Colonel Blimp, but never mind. We're all... I think there's a huge sense of disenchantment. And it needs a focus, and it needs a leader, the rise of reform, the riots, the sheer rage at how the legal and police establishment has handled the Southport killer. There is just a sense of disgrace and disgust, the collapsing popularity of Keir Starmer, falling off a cliff almost like our economy. All of those things point. And you see, I think there's something else. What we've got to understand, what I was trying to articulate there, and by the way, I apologize to everybody. I tried to fit far too much in, and it was much too long, but I hope I got the main big arguments over. Neil Ferguson, with whom I increasingly agree that the proper model for understanding contemporary politics is history. In other words, you don't invoke, this doesn't mean history repeats itself. It means human beings find themselves in analogous situations. And the earlier situations are a jolly good way of looking at it. We are actually in 1974. It's 50 years on. Heath has fallen. Harold Wilson has come in. Dennis Healey, remember he's taken tax rates up to 83%? We're heading to 25% inflation, and the IMF and 79. But remember, then it was just a question of you lot and free market economics. This is something more fundamental. But what Ferguson argued is that we've got to understand where we are now as a state of Britain in its late Soviet period. What we have is a nomenclatura. When Keir Starmer talks about the public service, he actually means the public sector, which is to be privileged in every single respect, that they have special pension rights, eminently symbolised by the fact that Sir Keir Starmer, KCMG, KC, has got an entire Act of Parliament devoted to protecting his pension taxation. Would you actually believe that? It is true. Similarly, you have the position in which there's going to be that pension contributions will be taxed, whatever. The public sector is automatically exempt. Everybody who has been rewarded is in the public sector. Now, what this means is, it is like late Soviet Russia. You have got not simply a public sector which is privileged. You have the Labour Party representing that public sector. So it's not the party of the working class, it's the party of the public sector. So you have the rule of the blob, by the blob, for the blob. But what's even more interesting, you've got a radical division. This is where I'm coming back to the point. You have a radical division of ideology and values between the ruling party, that lot, and the rule of law, and the rest of us who live in the real world. We're like the humble folk in 1984, and you know, the party echelons there. And it's that conflict of values, because what we've done, we have broken that compact that was the old constitution, in which was a broad agreement of values shaped by the values of the constitution. We've deliberately fragmented it. Again, the prioritization of minority groups is leading to communalism. For the first, Patrick, you're the one who knows all about this. For the first time since the High Middle Ages, we actually have warring groups in these islands. We have we have people who operate according to different systems of law and different systems of values, and they are entrenched by the state. They are deliberately defended because we have this extraordinary fact that the state, as Lord Bingham told us, is biased towards the minority.
David, I've shared with you, I think on many occasions, one piece of very bad news about me and one piece of very good news about me. The very bad news about me is that I studied PP at Balliol just over 30 years ago. The good news is it was over 30 years ago, so I've forgotten most of it. I've forgotten most of it since. I want to finish just by asking you, what do you think to whom should we make this clarion call? If we wish to reverse this process, is this a question of finding a single inspirational leader? Is it a question of persuading a major political party to make this its fundamental proposition? Is it a question of inch by inch persuading each and every member of the British public, or to get a newspaper to be the champions of this?
I can give you a very simple answer: all of them.
All of them.
Is all of them. But I would begin with the sheer process of persuasion. I think, and you and I have discussed this, we need a serious program of public education. If we are to revitalize democracy, if democracy is to survive, we must take the people seriously again. We need a serious campaign of public education. I want to embrace, because it would shock the left, I want to embrace votes at 16 and then make political education in schools compulsory with the access of every political party and interest group to them.
So begin and get to everybody as fast as we can, as clearly.
As fast as we can. Clearly, if one could rescue the Conservative Party, if one could persuade the party to the programme that I'm talking about, the idea, as it were, my outline of this, without, by the way, its grounding in the idea of a constant constitutional tradition. That's new for you. Written a little while ago, it will be coming out on the Spectator website shortly, in which I set out the basic programme that you and I have discussed, and the fact that in the same way the Conservative Party wakened up, led by Thatcher, the inspiring figure, with the creative intellectual genius Keith Joseph in 1979, set out to undo what Labour had done and to do something fresh. In other words, to do exactly what happened in 1660, exactly what happened in 1689, and exactly what did not happen in 2010. Otherwise, we're lost.
David, you've said we need a programme of public education. Thank you to all of those who put together the Oakeshott Lectures and generously fund them, but my particular thanks for you for kicking off that programme of public education so brilliantly today. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. David Starkey.